Ok, we're live. Estamos ao vivo, pessoal, começando mais uma das palestras do Remind Centro de Estudos. Para nós é uma grande alegria aqui hoje ter o professor Danie Strauss com a gente. O professor Danie vai poder se apresentar melhor, mas para nós que estudamos a filosofia reformacional, é uma honra tê-lo aqui com a gente. Eu aproveito para apresentar uma das obras dele, recentemente publicadas pela Paideia Press, sobre a filosofia de Hermann Doever, e além disso, professor Danie foi o editor das obras de Doever. Professor, I'm not seeing. Could you show to the camera in the front of your face?
Must I take it like that or like that?
That's fine this way. You can just put the book a little bit up so we can see.
Like this?
Put a bit higher.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, thank you.
Fine. Okay, and can you see I've got what you've got there as well, the English and the Spanish.
You can just put the book a little bit up, closer to your face. Yes.
Yes.
So what you have, I've got here as well.
Perfect. I was studying, and I am using this book, Professor, in my master thesis, and I have to thank you about this book too. Professor Strauss, ele foi editor, né, das obras do Doever. Ele também foi ele é, né, ainda, como ele está mostrando agora, um prolífico escritor na área de filosofia, na área de sociologia, e nós temos o prazer, a alegria enorme, a honra de termos o professor Danie Strauss com a gente. Então, aproveitem essa oportunidade, pessoal, tirem suas dúvidas, façam perguntas. Hoje ele vai estar aqui falando com a gente sobre sociologia e direito, e sem dúvida vai passar por vários fundamentos da filosofia reformacional. Eu vou passar a palavra agora para ele e para o Vinícius, para que eles possam se apresentar. Vinícius, pode pedir para ele, por favor, se apresentar, e aí depois você se apresenta também.
Okay. Professor Strauss, could you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your work and studies within the Reformational philosophy, please?
Sure. I was born in a Christian family, and we lived in South Africa from my early youth. Before that, by the late 17th and early 18th century, some Dutch and German immigrants came to South Africa. That's where the roots of Strauss are to be found. And I was at school, and I was always impressed with the way in which my father could answer any question I asked him. I was always impressed. He had insight, and he can open up new vistas for me. And
sure, let me translate you.
Sure.
Eu fui criado em uma família cristã na África do Sul. Imigrantes da Alemanha e dos Países Baixos imigraram para a África do Sul em um determinado momento, nos séculos 17 e 18, e daí vem o meu sobrenome Strauss. E durante a minha infância, eu sempre fiquei impressionado com a forma como meu pai era capaz de responder qualquer pergunta e sempre tinha bons insights sobre as perguntas que eu fazia.
Okay, so I knew that he studied abroad, but I didn't see any link anywhere. And then one day in my second last school year, I came back home and I told him what the history teacher taught us about the French Revolution and the slogan of liberty, freedom, liberty, and what was the third one? But nevertheless, he gave me an insight into the way in which the historians approach it, and said that they couldn't tell you more and put it in a new perspective because they haven't studied any political philosophy or philosophy. And then I said to him, no, tell me, what is philosophy? So you see, that is the question I should not have asked.
Ele sabia que eu sabia que meu pai tinha estudado fora, eu não sabia exatamente as conexões de onde ele vinha, mas uma vez eu cheguei em casa falando que eu tinha aprendido algo sobre a Revolução Francesa, o seu slogan de liberdade, igualdade, fraternidade, e meu pai, então, trouxe vários insights sobre a história da Revolução Francesa e a filosofia que estava por trás dessa revolução. E aí eu fiz, então, a pergunta que eu não devia ter feito para ele, o que é essa filosofia?
What triggered me in getting more and more interested in philosophy, and in particular in Dewey's philosophy, was given by the fact that going into this philosophy helped you to understand two things. The first one is the history and development of intellectual endeavors in not only philosophy, but also within the various special sciences, the natural sciences and the humanities. And that made it possible for me to discern what are the prominent issues in the foundations, the special science foundations of each discipline.
E o que me intrigou, então, quando ele começou a falar para mim sobre a filosofia e a filosofia de Dewey, e o que me fez me encantar por essa filosofia foram duas coisas. Primeiro é que a filosofia de Dewey nos dá um grande insight sobre a história intelectual, né, a história dos movimentos intelectuais, não apenas na filosofia, mas nas ciências especializadas, tanto as ciências naturais como as ciências humanas. E, em segundo lugar, essa filosofia nos permite discernir as questões primárias ou mais fundamentais que nós precisamos responder.
And as a result, I eventually studied some natural sciences, mathematics included, and some humanities. And in doing that, I got more and more acquainted with fundamental basic issues. And in the process of exploring those, I focused in my master's degree thesis on the issue of the philosophical foundations of the special sciences. So the Afrikaans title reads Huisbegeerte in vakwetenskap, philosophy and special science.
Como resultado desse interesse, eu passei a estudar as ciências especiais em geral. Estudei um pouco das ciências naturais, especialmente a matemática, e também as ciências humanas, e me tornei mais e mais familiarizado com as questões fundamentais, as questões básicas que permeiam essas disciplinas. E nesse processo eu me foquei, essa foi a minha tese de mestrado, nos fundamentos filosóficos das ciências especiais. Esse é o título da minha dissertação.
Okay, so one of the things that bothered people mostly when they hear about a Christian philosophy or even a Christian special science is that they think these disciplines, physics included and even biology, ought to be neutral, ought to be objective. They should be mere facts, and you should follow the path of the facts. But that okay.
Go ahead.
That's for this reason I started to look into what has happened. And the first thing that struck me was that every so-called exact special science, like mathematics or physics or biology, any one of those are in fact bound to diverging trends in the history of their existence. So if the discipline was supposed to be objective and neutral, how come that there are a history for that discipline, that is historical significant developments, and how is it possible if the discipline is supposed to be neutral?
Uma das coisas que incomoda as pessoas quando nós falamos numa filosofia cristã ou em ciências especiais feitas de forma cristã é que essas pessoas elas partem da pressuposição de que o conhecimento científico ele deve ser objetivamente neutro, ele deve ser objetivo, ele deve seguir simplesmente os fatos, seguir o caminho dos fatos. Mas o que eu percebi é que todas as ciências especiais, seja a matemática, a física, a biologia, elas estão permeadas de diversas tendências divergentes, diversas correntes divergentes. Isso pode ser observado do ponto de vista histórico, da história dessas ciências. E como é então possível, se elas são apenas guiadas pelos fatos, como é possível que elas contenham dentro de si tantas tendências diferentes?
Now, let us take an example. Immanuel Kant is known to be one of the most influential philosophers of the modern era after the Renaissance and the late medieval period. And Immanuel Kant wrote a book in 1781, which is quite influential, and it still is, with the title Critique of Pure Reason. Any one of you familiar with this work?
Yes.
Então,
por exemplo, Kant é um dos pensadores mais influentes da era moderna, escreveu em 1781 um livro intitulado A Crítica da Razão Pura. Acredito que vocês estejam familiarizados com esta obra.
So I realized that this work has three important subdivisions, and when I went into the issue, it turned out to be the case that the three subdivisions of the Critique of Pure Reason provided the springboard for the three main currents in 20th century mathematics. In Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, he treats space and time in the Transcendental Aesthetic. Then he moves on to the Transcendental Logic, in which he treats logic and concepts and categories. And then he has the Transcendental Dialectic, in which he gives an account of the so-called reason ideas. And the reason why I mention these three subdivisions is that each one of them, as I said, gave or provided a starting point for 20th century mathematics. The intuitionists latched on to the first division, the logicism the second, and formalism to the third. David Hilbert was the leading German mathematician at the time.
Bom, então, eu observei que essa obra de Kant, A Crítica da Razão Pura, ela contém três importantes subdivisões, e eu percebi que cada uma dessas três subdivisões, na verdade, nos proporciona o fundamento para as três principais correntes da matemática no século XX. Professor, could you repeat the first subdivision? I lost that one.
Okay, that was the section, the so-called Transcendental Aesthetic.
Ok, a primeira das subdivisões ele chamou de a estética transcendente, a segunda a lógica transcendente e a terceira a dialética transcendente. Cada uma dessas correntes ela fornece para a matemática as três principais tendências da matemática do século XX.
One does not have to think about art. His meaning, or the meaning attached by him to aesthetic, is the treatment of space and time as so-called inner and outer forms of intuition. So there was a very specific approach. And the fact that he dealt with space and time explains why it is related or had an influence on mathematics to begin with. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, let me translate this. Quando Kant, então, fala na estética, ele não está falando da arte, mas ele está falando do tempo e do espaço, como formas de intuição. E o fato de que Kant se dedicou a falar de tempo e espaço explica por que essa subdivisão do seu trabalho foi importante para a matemática.
So, for example, in the 20th century, the first decade, mathematics produced a wonderful spirit, a very sharp guy with the name of Brouwer, Laurentius Brouwer. He was a Dutchman, and he finished his PhD in 1907 about the foundations of mathematics. And he performed exceptionally well. He has proven a number of important stuff, the invariance of the dimension number and other things you don't have to understand to know that he actually created a whole new mathematics with its own inner structure, and it finds no equivalent in classical mathematics. So it's not just a matter of talking about mathematics, he created his own mathematics.
Por exemplo, então, no início, na primeira década do século XX, um holandês de nome Laurentius Brouwer, ele fundou uma ciência, uma corrente da matemática que é totalmente diferente. Ele criou a sua própria matemática, por assim dizer, com a sua própria estrutura interna, e que não guarda correspondência com a matemática clássica.
So what I was interested in is to find a way to explain easily and not in too difficult terms, the reason for this divergence of mathematical points of view. And as an introduction to this venture, which I tried to understand and to research, I came up with a suggestion, which is the following. Would you be willing to tell me what do you think is the sum of 3 plus 4? Anyone?
Então, quando eu me interessei em procurar uma resposta para explicar a razão para essas divergentes correntes na matemática, esses pontos de vista divergentes na matemática, eu tentei fazer essa explicação de uma forma simples e me veio a seguinte sugestão. Como é que nós explicamos, como é que nós respondemos de uma forma simples qual é a soma de 3 mais 4? Is it 7?
Well, it is 7 if you assume that you are working with numbers. If you are working with vectors, a vector has direction and distance. Then you have spatial subjects, not numerical subjects. And if you walk, for instance, from a point 0, you walk 3 miles northwards, then 4 miles to the east, then you are exactly 5 miles away from where you started. And this is a vector sum. In this case, it's 3 plus 4 equals 5, not 7.
Ok.
So ok, go ahead first.
Então, 3 mais 4 só é igual a 7 se nós estivermos pensando, assumindo que nós estamos trabalhando com números. Sim, se estamos trabalhando com números, 3 mais 4 é 7. Mas se nós estamos trabalhando com vetores, vetores possuem direção e sentido. Então, se eu caminhar um vetor de 3 unidades para o norte e depois caminhar 4 unidades para o leste, o resultado dessa soma, na verdade, é 5. A soma vetorial de 3 mais 4 não é 7, é 5.
So, of course, anyone is always interested in the material world, the physical world. And one of the prominent German physicists, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, who has published extensively also on the foundations of physics, he wrote a beautiful book with the 10 biggest or most important physicists through the history of Western civilization. Now, he recently made the claim that the ruling religion of our day is physicalism, the deification of the material universe. And what worried me was the fact that if you contemplate the nature of any scientific, or let's call it rather natural law, or law of nature is the preferable way to address it. Like the law of inertia, or the law of energy constancy, the conservation of energy. If you look at any one of these laws, then you find that, let us put it in the box of trying to say what is green. If I have discerned as a physicist the conditions for being green, that is to say, the law for being green, then I realize that these conditions themselves are not green. So if everything is physical, what is the status of the physical laws of nature? Because they can't be themselves physical, so you contradict yourself with the first step you give.
Então, um outro escritor, pesquisador que escreveu sobre os fundamentos da física, ele procurou produzir uma história da física seguindo pela civilização ocidental. E ele escreveu nesse livro que a religião predominante, ou a religião que domina o nosso tempo, é o fisicalismo, que ele chama de a deificação do universo material. E ele começa a explicar essa ideia apontando para o fato de que se nós contemplarmos a natureza de qualquer lei natural, ou lei científica, ou lei da natureza, como você queira chamar, como, por exemplo, a inércia, ou a lei da conservação de energia. Se você olhar para a natureza de qualquer uma dessas leis, você vai ver que elas exigem algo fora delas mesmas. Então, por exemplo, as leis ou condições para... Se você se perguntar quais são as leis ou condições para que algo seja verde, você vai ver que as leis e condições para que algo seja verde não são elas mesmas verdes.
Okay, the next step one can give is to start and try to account for the way in which matter was described throughout the history of Western civilization and the development of physics as a discipline, as a science. Because the moment you start doing that, you realize that initially in Greek culture, the Pythagoreans ruled the day, and they thought you could express the essence of anything simply by exploring the ratio between the two. And the two are the so-called integers, and if you look at the ratios, you have fractions. And they believed everything in reality could be captured by using fractions. But then they... Okay, go first, Ed.
Então, se você pensar, quando nós pensamos então nessa história da civilização ocidental e pensarmos na matemática, por exemplo, na antiguidade clássica, os pitagóricos, eles dominaram a conversa, e eles basicamente ensinavam que eles procuravam em tudo uma razão uma fração por 2. Então, eles tentaram explicar toda a realidade, dividindo a realidade sempre em duas partes.
Now, we know nowadays that was an overestimation of the meaning of number, but its attractiveness did not really disappear, because when there's a little booklet written on the history of mathematics, and the interesting point that came up was that he said, if everything is number, if number rules the world, then we are on top of that because we rule number. So amidst the absolutization of ancient Greece, mathematics, and even modern mathematics, we did not escape from the effort to take something and lift it out, elevate it to the rank of being divine, a kind of absolutization or deification.
Então, outro livro que fala sobre essa história da matemática nos mostra que hoje os cientistas sabem, ou os pensadores em geral sabem, que aquilo que aconteceu com os pitagóricos foi um exagero do número, os números foram colocados numa estima muito elevada. Mas essa atração pelos números, ela não desapareceu na Antiguidade Clássica. Um outro livro sobre a história da matemática diz o seguinte: se tudo é número e nós dominamos os números, então o homem que domina os números é o que está no topo de tudo. Então, o que aconteceu nessa antiguidade grega foi que a filosofia da matemática foi absolutizada, ou foi deificada, ela foi tratada como sendo a explicação para todas as coisas.
So what happened then, when it got stuck in the discovery that you cannot express everything given in nature or in figures, geometrical figures, in terms of two integers or a fraction, then it was discovered by Hippasus of Metapont, and he discovered it on the regular pentagram, and because it was not possible to do it, they switched to space, and subsequently they tried to explain everything in terms of space. Even arithmetic became a subdivision of geometry, and to make it a bit faster, then when this ruled for quite some time throughout the medieval period, we find the early modern period with the Renaissance, Descartes and what came after him. And first it was a reduction of, this time, not to number of space, but to motion.
Então, o que a gente vai ver, então, nesse desenvolvimento histórico da matemática é que depois da fração ou da aritmética, a geometria passa a ser dominante como a tentativa de explicar todas as coisas. Um filósofo da matemática descobriu que, por exemplo, não é possível reduzir formas geométricas como o pentagrama a uma fórmula aritmética. Então, a noção de espaço levou a aritmética a se tornar uma subdivisão da geometria, e, posteriormente, o movimento passou a ser a filosofia dominante na matemática.
So when that happened, the ultimate step to be taken was to move from number to space to movement and then to energy operation, physical force. And it's interesting that a very prominent mathematician and philosopher, Bertrand Russell, that he considered the concept of force to be internally contradictory. And even more astonishingly is the position taken by Heinrich Hertz. In the 1886, he discovered the electromagnetic waves, and that eventually made possible the radio and the television. And he also considered the concept of force to be intrinsically contradictory. And that went back even to Newton. When Newton formulated his law of gravity, he provided a formula. He said if you multiply the mass of one body with the mass of another body, and you divide it by the square of the distance between them, so then you have m times m divided by r square. If that is the case, then that is the force with which two bodies attract each other. And if the concept force is contradictory, then Newton's law of gravity is not valid. But nonetheless, Newton won the day, and he showed that it's even without being able to see a connection, to see a interaction between bodies, they can still attract each other with that force. And so some of the most incredible mathematical calculations followed. But what happened is that the first four basic aspects of reality which dooyeweer distinguishes is given in the numerical, the spatial, the kinematic, and the physical. And just one little correction to your understanding of the kinematic. One cannot ask what the cause of motion is. One can only ask what the cause of a change of motion is. Be it acceleration or deceleration.
Então, o que nós vemos no final dessa sequência histórica é que depois da aritmética, da geometria, e do movimento, o que passou a dominar a filosofia da matemática foi a ideia de força. Nós podemos ver essa ideia de força dominando o restante da história da matemática, com a ênfase na física, mas o filósofo da matemática Bertrand Russell, ele afirmou que o conceito de força ele é internamente contraditório. E acontece que, se esse conceito de força é internamente contraditório, as leis de Newton, como a lei da gravidade, por exemplo, não poderia existir. Apesar dessa afirmação de Russell, as leis de Newton se aplicam, elas foram utilizadas, e é possível observar a presença de corpos que se atraem mutuamente por aquilo que nós chamamos de lei da gravidade. Então, nós temos aqui os 4 aspectos básicos da realidade: o aspecto numérico, o aspecto espacial, o aspecto cinemático e o aspecto físico. Com relação ao aspecto cinemático, uma correção importante é que muitas vezes nós pensamos que é possível determinar qual é o curso de um movimento, mas, na verdade, a única coisa que é possível determinar é o curso de uma cadeia de movimento. Nós só conseguimos observar aceleração e desaceleração.
May I make a little side remark? When you named the first 4 aspects, I realized that you are using terms still familiar across a large number of languages in the modern era. because they are so fundamental. The names which are used to designate them cannot escape from them. So the next step which I gave was to have a look at the biotic and the theories in biology. And there I was surprised to realize that there's not just one biological point of view. Although in our current world, everyone refers to evolution as if there's just one single perspective that is called evolutionary or evolution. And in fact, one gets, even after Darwin, 150 years ago, one gets a number of biological trends of thought. There's in Germany a guy with the name of Eisenstein, not Einstein, and he wrote 2 articles about 50 years ago, and I've never seen any 2 articles containing so many critical points raised against New Darwinism. But you have the physicalist main tendency; those are what von Weizsäcker called the religion. But in addition to that, you have holism, a holistic trend in modern biology. There was Meyer and Adolf Meyer and Jan Smuts, the general from South Africa. And then you have panpsychism, which elevated the sensitive psychic mode. And then you have a few more. And in the intelligent design, currently pretty popular, is a derivative of vitalism dating back to Aristotle.
Então, após o aspecto físico que nós acabamos de observar, vem o aspecto biótico e o aspecto físico, psíquico sensitivo. Quando nós pensamos, então, sobre o aspecto biótico e o desenvolvimento da biologia como uma ciência, há muitas críticas contra o novo darwinismo, por assim, o neodarwinismo, por assim dizer. Por exemplo, 50 anos atrás, um pensador chamado Eisenstein escreveu um artigo que contém apresenta inúmeros pontos críticos ou pontos de fragilidade do neodarwinismo. Nós observamos diversas tendências dentro da biologia também, assim como nós observamos na matemática, nós podemos observar diversas tendências divergentes na biologia. A tendência predominante, como nós mencionamos antes, é o fisicalismo, que é a religião predominante de nossa era. Mas há também uma tendência holística, representada, por exemplo, por Meyer, e há também o panpsiquismo, e hoje, em nossos dias, é bem popular o design inteligente, que é uma forma derivada do vitalismo de Aristóteles.
So there are a few more, but in the case of biology, it is interesting that the new Darwinists are not really trying to interact with those who are belonging to a different school of thought, and that is in itself something you should be suspicious of, because it shows that the objectivities, the so-called, and the neutrality is rather embedded in a prejudice that cannot withstand a test against the facts. Now, the same applies to psychology. Even in the discipline of logic, there are fascinating differences of opinion of different kinds of logic, because we have to begin in logic with the 4 basic logical principles: the principle of identity, A is A; the principle of non-contradiction, A is not non-A; the principle of the excluded third or middle. If you have 2, then there are no third option. It's either raining or not raining, and there's no third option. And then there's a new principle introduced by a dooyeweerd, and it's a fantastic, fruitful principle. It is called the principle of the excluded antinomy. Now, I shall just now explain what an antinomy is.
Então, se nós pularmos as divergências na psicologia e chegarmos à lógica, existe também uma diversidade de opiniões. É claro que todos começam com alguns princípios básicos. Os princípios tradicionalmente afirmados na lógica, são o princípio da identidade, o princípio da não contradição e o princípio do terceiro excluído. há um quarto princípio que foi introduzido por Dooyeweerd e tem se provado muito frutífero, que é o princípio da antinomia excluída. E eu vou explicar algo mais sobre ele em breve.
So in 1783, Immanuel Kant published a work on an introduction to every future metaphysics, with a pretty long German name, which I shall leave aside. But he also used a beautiful example of a better understanding of the logical principle of non-contradiction. And he realized that this principle stipulates only that you cannot decide which one of two contradictories is the correct one. You can only say it's either A or non-A, but whether or not it is A or non-A, you can't say. Just if you only have a contradiction. So let us take an example of a simple logical contradiction. Kant produced this example in his Prolegomena, and it says there is something like a square circle. That is an illogical concept, a square circle. Why? It is illogical because it disobeys both the principle of identity and the principle of non-contradiction. The principle of identity says A is A, but now A is non-A because a circle is now a square. And vice versa, or if you turn it around, then you cannot say that it is both a square and a circle, because then you are using contradictory terms. It's simply not possible to characterize something by confusing it with two spatial figures, spatial subjects. And a circle is a circle, and it's not a non-circle, and a square is a square, it's not a non-square. But these two figures are spatial figures, so you get them within the aspect of space. But what about an antinomy? Before I go ahead, let's just catch up.
Ok. Em 1783, Kant publicou uma obra chamada Introdução a toda a metafísica futura, acho que foi assim o título que ele explicou, e ele traz um exemplo interessante de não contradição. Se você apenas tem a lei da não contradição, você pode dizer que A não pode ser não A, mas você não consegue decidir entre os dois. E o exemplo que ele dá é o exemplo de você falar em um círculo quadrado. Esse é um conceito ilógico. Por quê? Porque ele desobedece não só à lei da não contradição, mas ele desobedece também à lei da identidade. Você está dizendo que um círculo é um não círculo, e você também está dizendo que o círculo que um quadrado é um não quadrado. Então, você está quebrando tanto a lei da identidade quanto a lei da não contradição ao confundir figuras geométricas. Mas nós precisamos ter em vista que essas são figuras espaciais, e, portanto, o aspecto espacial está em vista.
Okay, let us take now two examples of antinomies, and then I explain the relationship between an antinomy and a logical contradiction. Suppose you are a historicist, a trend of thought that became prominent by the beginning of the 19th century in Europe, after the Enlightenment, the conceptual rationalism of the 18th century, where Kant was the ruling spirit. Historicism claimed that whatever there is subject to radical historical change.
Então, eu vou explicar, então, agora um outro exemplo que vai nos ajudar a entender a relação entre o princípio da antinomia excluída e o princípio da não contradição. Suponha que você é um historicista. O historicismo é um movimento que surgiu no século XIX na Europa e que afirma que tudo que existe está sujeito a uma mudança histórica radical.
Okay, let us look at the historicism first. It says whatever there is caught up in the process of historical change. There's nothing firm, nothing steadfast, nothing constant. Everything changes. Now, if that's the case, you have a serious problem to account for the history of anything. Suppose you want to write a history of legal thought or legal practices or economic institutions or even scholarly thinking. You have to have a subject which is forming the basis for the historical changes you are claiming. But the problem is that only something that is not itself intrinsically historical can have a history. So if I say art, economics, love, justice, whatever there is intrinsically historical, then there is nothing left that can have a history. And this is the irony of apostate God eliminating isms. The historicism pursue its road by reifying, once again, absolutizing the historical to such an extent that there is nothing left that can serve as the basis for the history you want to write or whatever.
Então, o historicismo, ele afirma, como eu disse, que tudo o que existe está preso ou sujeito ao processo histórico, ao processo de mudança histórica. O que nós precisamos entender é que, se isso for verdade, nós temos um problema para contar ou para relatar a história de qualquer coisa. Se tudo está sujeito à história e não há um ponto de partida que está fora da história, então nós não temos como fazer um relato histórico de nada. Nós precisamos de algo que não seja histórico para termos a história de alguma coisa. Então, quando nós pensamos em uma história da arte, uma história do amor, uma história da justiça, é só afirmando que essas coisas estão fora da história ou que elas existem à parte do aspecto histórico que nós podemos ter uma história. Então, ele acaba nesse problema em que, ao definir a história e os conceitos, ele absolutiza a história, mas contradiz a si mesmo.
Okay, a similar criticism could be launched against the vitalism of Albert Schweitzer. Live and let live as a motto cannot give an account of heterotrophic animals, which is dependent upon eating what is supposed not to be eaten. He didn't kill the flies in his hospital so that people got more ill instead of more healthy. But let's take the other example. If you look at the nature of space and movement, then you encounter in the history of philosophy in the school of Zeno, or the school of Parmenides, you encounter Zeno, and Zeno wanted to eliminate multiplicity and movement. So the true being is what is static and always the same, and thought and being are the same. This is the position taken by Parmenides and Zeno. But then it runs into a similar issue. Let us look at his famous fragment 4, only 4 are left, in which it is said that anything moving neither moves in the space it occupies, nor in the space it does not occupy. So listen good to it. He grants movement, whatever moves. And once he has granted movement, he turns around and says, okay, but where does it move? It can't move in the space it is. It cannot move in the space it is not occupying. So then he denies it once again, and then he lays bare simply the antinomy, the reduction of more than one aspect to just one aspect. So whereas an antinomy is intermodal, concerns different modal aspects, a plain logical contradiction concerns only what is happening within one aspect. If we speak about a square circle, we are just speaking about within this spatial aspect. We are not confusing two aspects, but two different spatial figures.
Então, para dar um outro exemplo, quando nós pensamos sobre a natureza do espaço e do movimento, nós temos o famoso paradoxo de Zeno, né, que era da escola de Parmênides, e que tentou eliminar a multiplicidade e o movimento, afirmando que um verdadeiro ser, um verdadeiro ente é estático e é sempre o mesmo. E ao formular o seu paradoxo, o problema do raciocínio, do argumento de Zeno, é que ele tenta explicar duas categorias diferentes, espaço e movimento, reduzindo-as a um único aspecto. E aqui nós temos a diferença entre o princípio da antinomia excluída e o princípio da não contradição. Quando nós dizemos que um círculo, quando nós falamos de um círculo quadrado, isso é apenas um problema de não contradição, isso é apenas uma contradição, porque nós estamos falando de um único aspecto da realidade, o aspecto espacial. Mas quando nós falamos de uma contradição que abrange dois aspectos diferentes, uma contradição, por assim dizer, intermodal, então o problema que nós temos aí é um problema de antinomia excluída. Nós estamos confundindo categorias conceituais que pertencem a aspectos diferentes.
Very well done. So we can now close the circle. I started with mathematics and various points of view within it. And if we look at mathematics even today, then you will find that modern intuitionist or new intuitionist mathematics developed, as I've mentioned, its own distinct mathematics. And part of their makeup is that they query, they question the principle of the excluded third in the case of the infinite. And that made them objecting to what the formalists and classical mathematics have done. And it is quite interesting then to realize that even a so-called exact mathematical proof could be questioned if you do not accept the main assumption of classical mathematics lying at its basis. So the handout which I've given to you has two appendices. The one is on this example, which I'm not going to spell out in detail. I'll just give you the upshot. The other one is an appendix on the particle-wave duality of physical entities.
I'm trying to find it here.
I can repeat if you missed anything.
Yeah, please.
I just want to show that by not accepting the principle of the excluded middle, classical mathematics ran into trouble because one of the key proofs dating the rise of modern 20th century mathematics is found in the work of a German mathematician, Georg Cantor. And he designed and developed modern set theory and the whole transfinite arithmetic. And his decisive proof is dependent upon the acceptance of a kind of infinity rejected by the intuitionists.
Então, quando nós, para nós fecharmos esse círculo, nós estamos falando sobre diferentes pontos de vista na matemática. E se nós pensarmos hoje no que acontece com alguém que defende uma filosofia da matemática intuísta ou neo-intuísta, aquilo que eles afirmam ao questionar o princípio do terceiro excluído torna impossível até mesmo a apresentação de provas matemáticas básicas. A sua maneira de rejeitar os formalistas e a matemática clássica coloca em xeque toda e qualquer prova matemática.
The interesting thing surrounding this issue is the fact that Aristotle distinguished two kinds of infinity. He spoke about the potential infinite and the actual infinite. And if you come back to the modern era, you will find that his account was dependent upon what I would call, well, let me approach it from the other side. If you think about infinity, the most basic intuition of infinity we have is simply one, another one, yet another one, and so on indefinitely, infinitely. So this is what I call the successive infinite. Aristotle called it the potential infinite, but it's not intuitively clear what that means. And then the other kind of infinity Cantor accepted, as I said, it called it the actual infinite. But this actual infinite was supposed to be given at once as a whole, not in succession, not one, another one, and so on. And that helped Cantor, for example, to check what is the case with the different systems of number. If you have the natural numbers, 1 plus 2 plus 3, or just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you look at them, then you can see you can go on without an end. It is literally endless. Now the question is whether all the other number or numerical systems are also what one may call, sorry, just for a moment I want to repeat. One should realize that it's not just succession, but it is a question of putting things together as a whole. And if you have them as a whole, they are given all at once. So you will find in the handout that I've given to you that there's a proof for the so-called non-denumerability of the real numbers. You have the integers, then you have the fractions, then you have the irrational numbers like the square root of 2, and you can absorb them within the so-called real numbers. Now, if you need to use the real numbers in order to prove the non-denumerability of the real numbers, and unfortunately, the intuitionists don't accept the at-once infinite. They only accept the successive infinite.
Então, quando nós pensamos no infinito, Aristóteles ele tinha dois conceitos para explicar o infinito. Um que ele chama de infinito potencial e outro que ele chama de infinito atual. O infinito potencial, que eu chamo de sucessivo, é aquele que corresponde à nossa intuição mais básica de que existe uma sucessão interminável de números. 1, 2, 3. Isso vale para os números reais. Quando nós falamos do infinito atual, nós falamos de um infinito que não se apresenta numa sucessão numérica, mas que deve ser levado em conta como um todo. E quando nós pensamos em diferentes sistemas numéricos, essa ideia do infinito atual nos ajuda a entender por que, a explicar a existência desses diferentes sistemas numéricos. Quando nós nos perguntamos se os demais sistemas numéricos são infinitos, como os números reais, nós precisamos desse conceito de infinito atual para explicá-lo.
Let us illustrate it to you in a very simple way. Suppose I ask all of you sitting right now here in front of me, so if you have a number written as follows, 0.9999 and so on indefinitely. And I ask you now, is this value written on the blackboard, so, for example, is it equal to or smaller than the number 1?
Vamos imaginar o seguinte exemplo. Imagine que eu coloco para todos vocês que estão sentados aqui um número 0.9999, uma sequência indefinida de noves depois da vírgula. E eu pergunto a vocês, esse número ele é igual ou menor do que 1?
Okay, let us see what you are coming up with. Some will support the one view, some the other one. Which are in support of the idea that it is not equal to 1? It's smaller than 1, and which are in favor of the idea that it is equal to 1?
I would say it's less than 1.
Okay, and any one of the others who would say the opposite?
I don't think they can interact with us right now.
Okay. So suppose we have got another guy, X, and you have chosen for the smaller, and the other guy would choose for it is equal. Now, what happens there is that if you say it's not equal, you are applying the successive infinite. But if you apply at once infinite, then you can observe the sequence of successive numbers, or successively infinite numbers, as if they are given all at once, without any succession as an infinite whole or totality.
Então, quando Quando você responde que essa sequência 0.9999 é menor do que 1, você está pensando em termos de um infinito sequencial, ou sucessivo. Mas quando nós pensamos nesse infinito enquanto um todo, nós observamos que esse número ele é uma totalidade, portanto, ele é 1.
Okay. If we now give another step, then we should realize that mathematically speaking, pure arithmetic does not have any urge towards the at once infinite or the actual infinite. That is something that you have to introduce by looking at the way in which number imitates what is given within space. So if we speak about a whole number, then that notion of wholeness is reflecting the meaning of integers. And if you want to break them up, you get fractions. And the next step is you can try to see what you can do with the real numbers or the irrational numbers. But the fact is that you cannot account for the at once infinite without implicitly or explicitly making an appeal to the at once infinite.
Então, o que nós observamos com isso é que a aritmética não pode, por si só, explicar esse infinito de uma vez só, esse infinito atual, como Aristóteles chama. Essa ideia de um número inteiro, de inteireza, é uma analogia espacial. E a partir dela, começando com essa analogia espacial, que nós podemos partir, então, para as frações. Não é possível explicar as frações simplesmente com o aspecto numérico ou aritmético. É preciso partir para essa analogia.
It's good that you ended your remarks with the word analogy, because that's what we get. We have to realize that the interconnections between number and space will help us to understand why you cannot explore the at once infinite without making an appeal to the meaning of space. Because space is governed by the time order of simultaneity, whereas the numerical aspect is determined by the successive infinite. So succession and simultaneity are the two key terms. And if you have the way in which number anticipates pointing forward to the spatial aspect, only then can you account for what is happening by using the idea of the at once infinite. And if we now leave that aside and take a jump, what is supposed or presupposed in the story I told you is the idea that there's something unique to number, discrete quantity, and it's expressed in the successive numbers. And there's something unique in space, the order of simultaneity, and the fact that every spatial figure ought to be there at once. If I have a triangle, I cannot have the one side and then the other side and then the third one. They ought to be present, all three at once, at the same time. And if that is the case, then we realize that there must be primitive terms that you cannot further define. You can synonymize them, but you cannot define them. So let us take, you studied law. Perhaps you have had a glimpse of Dooyeweer's encyclopedia of the science of law. Yes. But one of the first questions is, how can we define law?
Let me translate this part. Então, a gente precisa observar, então, que essa interconexão entre o aspecto numérico e o aspecto espacial nos ajuda a entender por que nós não podemos explicar o significado do espaço reduzindo ao aspecto numérico. Existem algumas ideias intuitivas que estão relacionadas ao aspecto numérico e outra ideia intuitiva que está relacionada ao aspecto espacial. Quando nós pensamos no aspecto numérico, a ordem de sucessão é o que predomina. Quando nós pensamos no aspecto espacial, é a ideia de simultaneidade que predomina. Então, aquilo que é singular para o número é a ideia de quantidade ou de sucessão. Aquilo que é singular para a ideia de espaço é a ideia de simultaneidade. Você não pode definir um triângulo começando com um lado, depois o outro lado, depois o outro lado. Para que você defina triângulo, você precisa que os três lados estejam presentes ao mesmo tempo. Então, essa ideia de simultaneidade que é essencial para o conceito, para a ideia de espaço. Isso nos leva a perceber que existem termos primitivos que nós não conseguimos definir. Nós só podemos chegar a eles por meio de uma aproximação, por meio de algum tipo de sinonímia. Se nós pensarmos, por exemplo, em Dooyeweerd e na sua enciclopédia da ciência da lei ou do direito, Dooyeweerd inicia mostrando a dificuldade que nós temos de definir o que é direito.
Okay, we can take as an example the Dutch legal scholar Poorlach, and he tried to give the following definition of law, or the jural side of reality. He said it's an objective, let me just repeat, objective harmonizing of a multiplicity of interests. And if you just give that, let me just repeat it in the Dutch form. Objectieve transegoïstische belangen. It's an objective, that is to say transsubjective harmonization of interests. The problem is objective has the meaning that it appeals to whatever there is. It's not specific or distinct about the jural. Harmonization is coming from the aesthetic, and then you have multiplicity of interests. Multiplicity is numerical. Interest could be multi-vocal because you can have economic interest or ethical interest and so on. So Dooyeweerd concluded that this kind of definition is simply trying to capture a rule for spreading of alms amongst the poor. But he didn't give a definition of the law. Why not? Because it missed out on the kernel, which is in Dutch tribution or retribution, but it doesn't get over that well. So rather use tribution or retribution. Are you still there?
Vinícius, não estamos te ouvindo. Você está aí ainda?
Sorry, I've left out one element. It's an objective trans-egoistic harmonization of legal interests. So that the trans-egoistic is derived from moral love, not from the jural.
Professor, seems to me that Vinicius is having some issues with his connection. Let me verify this and we will continue, okay?
Okay, that's fine.
Professor,
Sure.
Vinicius had talked to me that he have some trouble with the room in the seminary that he was using to make the translation. So he is correcting this right now. He's solving this problem, and
Okay.
then we will try to do a pause here for allow him to solve this problem. Could you make a
Okay.
break of 5 minutes,
Yeah, sure. No problem
five or
whatsoever.
10 minutes, and then we
Better.
we we come back to the broadcast? No, I can stop the cameras, and we can come back in 10 minutes. What do you think?
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Then
Yeah,
we continue with the translation and with the concept of law that you
that's right.
are developing. Okay?
Okay, it's 2023. It's 10 minutes.
Okay. Perfect. So
Okay,
let's
thanks. Yeah,
let's do let's do this break and we
listen.
will come back in 10 minutes.
Okay, sounds good.
Pessoal, nós vamos fazer uma pausa de 10 minutos. Vinícius teve alguns problemas na conexão dele do seminário, e aí nós retornamos em 10 minutos e o professor continua dessa parte sobre o conceito de direito, ok? Pedimos que todos permaneçam, eu vou manter a transmissão ao vivo, mas nós vamos fazer essa pausa parando as câmeras aqui durante esse tempo de 10 minutos, tá bom? Já voltamos.
Ja. Zie graag weer aan.
Professor Danie, if
Yes?
you want, you can stop your camera for now.
How do I do that?
Okay, but be comfortable. Don't no problem.
Yeah, I have to move to a different room where I'm closer to a connection. The power is now at 30%. It was at 100% when we started, so I must move to a seat where I can connect the power supply to my computer.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, that's up to
You can use these few minutes to arrange what you need.
Yeah, I'll do that. But you don't have. You can watch me do the study room, as you can see. I'll see you after almost 10 minutes.
Okay, we're back. Professor, are you listening to me?
Yes, the alarm went off accidentally. I just want to get my cell phone, otherwise they're going to call me in a bit. Just 30 seconds.
Okay, Vinicius is coming back too. Ok, Vinícius também está de volta. Conseguimos resolver o problema lá na sala em que Vinícius estava. O professor Danie também está voltando.
Eventueel nog 75 vooruit, dus dan gelukkig weer.
Professor, we...
You hear me now?
Yes, yes.
I do. Sorry for that, Professor.
Just I click on the your show now. Everyone can see and hear you. As I click.
Can you see me? Arthur, tu me ouve?
Escuto sim. Eu acho que o professor Danie que está tendo problema na conexão. Professor, are you listening to us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Professor, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Sorry for the issue I had here.
Does it mean you can hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Seems that we are back with the connection and we must continue with the lecture. Professor, we need to finish the event until 9 p.m. in South Africa time, okay?
I don't see any. Now I see movement. But I don't hear anything.
I think that your connection is not good, Professor, at this moment.
Well, I'm closer to my source than where I was on the other side.
I can hear you well,
Wi-Fi.
but I think you're having trouble hearing me.
No, I hear you perfectly now.
Okay. Okay, so I think we can move on with the lecture. Could we finish it in 30 minutes?
That's fine. So
okay.
Just proceed to where we stopped.
Okay, yeah, you can just resume.
Okay, we stopped with Poorlach's definition of law, as an objective trans-egoistic harmonization of interests, and we saw that it doesn't contain anything typical of the dual. The other option is, so what happened here is that one used terms coming from other aspects than the dual to define it. But most of the time you are actually reducing it to something else. And that is the heuristic value of doing philosophy, that it helps you to recognize what is primitive, what is can only be approximated by intuitive knowledge, and it helps you to realize that you cannot define primitive terms, you have to accept them and then use them to define whatever else there is. And part of the story is you can proceed by looking at the meaning of an aspect in the following way. The meaning of an aspect is constituted by all the analogical moments found within it, but actually referring to those aspects distinct from the specific aspect you want to define. So one can in general say that an aspect reveals its meaning in its coherence with all the other aspects.
Então, onde nós paramos, nós estávamos falando da definição do que é o direito, o aspecto jurídico, e uma definição possível é de que o direito o direito consiste da harmonização de interesses em conflito. O que nós observamos quando nós olhamos para essa definição é que ela não apresenta nada que seja propriamente jurídico. E isso nos mostra que a definição daquilo que é primitivo em cada aspecto, aquilo que é primitivo em cada aspecto não pode ser definido, mas pode ser apenas objeto de uma aproximação. E uma maneira de fazer essa aproximação é basicamente recorrer a analogias com todos os demais aspectos. E essa forma de aproximação do conceito primitivo do direito revela que cada aspecto precisa ser definido em sua coerência com os demais aspectos.
Okay, so once we have reached the point of recognizing that the meaning of an aspect only comes to expression with all the other aspects, one has to start by applying insight to our understanding of any aspect. And in the case of the dual, the legal act, it's straightforward, but you keep now in mind that every aspect has a law side or a norm side, and as its correlate, a factual side. In actual side, you have subjects and objects, so you get a factual subject-object relation and a factual subject-subject relation. And once you realize that, you must give an account of the inevitability of encountering primitive terms, key elements of other aspects in an analogical mode or way within a specific aspect. What it entails is, and I'll just give the definition, and then you can proceed with the translation. It entails that, sorry, is it fine?
Yeah. Can I translate that part?
Okay, translate the part up to there.
Então, uma vez que nós tínhamos chegado a esse ponto em que nós reconhecemos essa impossibilidade de definição dos termos primitivos, nós precisamos também reconhecer que cada aspecto da realidade possui dois lados, o que Doivert chama de lado lei e o que Doivert chama de lado efeito. E o lado efeito ou lado efeitual, ele é composto do lado sujeito e do lado objeto. Então, nós podemos falar de cada aspecto com base nesses diferentes lados. E quando nós falamos dessa forma, é inevitável que nós encontremos, ao mesmo tempo, termos primitivos, ou seja, termos que pertencem propriamente àquele aspecto, como, por exemplo, o aspecto jurídico, e termos que, na verdade, consistem de analogias com outros aspectos da realidade.
Okay, so if we now proceed from that point, we can understand that there may be analogies, that is to say, forward-pointing and backward-pointing structural moments within the various aspects, through which this or those aspects reveal their meaning. And that's quite an important insight, because every discipline, from mathematics up to theology, is confronted with analogical moments. Now, an analogy is found when two aspects are similar in that respect in which they differ. Listen again, it sounds like a contradiction, but it isn't. Two aspects are similar in that respect in which they differ. Now, some
se
few
nós
examples just now.
Se nós começarmos então desse ponto, nós vamos entender que cada aspecto da realidade possui um conjunto de analogias. Analogias que nós podemos falar, definir como sendo analogias para frente, analogias antecipatórias, e analogias para trás, ou retroncipatórias. E isso mostra que esse conjunto de analogias revela o significado de cada aspecto. E todas as disciplinas, desde a matemática até a teologia, todas essas disciplinas se confrontam com isso que Dooyeweerd chama de momentos analógicos. E de todas essas disciplinas ou ciências especiais, elas são semelhantes naquilo que elas têm de diferente. Isso pode parecer uma contradição, mas não é. Eu vou explicar. Essas duas disciplinas são semelhantes naquilo que elas possuem de diferente em relação às demais.
We take this as an example, the connection between the social aspect and the spatial aspect. Suppose you observe what's happening when the president with his bodyguard arrives somewhere. Then you will notice there's a physical space proximity. They're close by each other, right? But at the same time, you notice that there's a huge difference in terms of the position they occupy, or the respective positions they occupy within human society. So there is an element of similarity, distance. But in this moment of similarity, the difference evinces itself, because physical or physico-spatial proximity is close by and social distance is far apart. The same applies to the physical aspect and the spatial aspect. They are both extended, but physical space is not infinitely divisible, and in the case of mathematical space, it is. Now, the reason we have to go to this route is now to show, if we have enough time to lift out just a few elements, to show that you cannot properly involve yourself in a special scientific activity if you are not giving an account of the analogical basic concepts of that discipline. And let's just explore a few. Dooyeweerd explored the legal, the jural, and I shall use the social because you've mentioned the social as well.
Okay.
First of all, you can speak about the social order.
May I translate this? Thank you. Então, para ficar num exemplo em que nós mostramos essa diferença dos aspectos a partir daquilo que eles têm de semelhantes, nós podemos pensar, por exemplo, nas analogias entre o aspecto social e o aspecto espacial. Se você pensar, por exemplo, no segurança de um presidente, ele está muito próximo espacialmente do presidente, ele fica sempre muito próximo do presidente espacialmente, mas socialmente eles ocupam espaços muito diferentes. Então, aquilo que esses aspectos possuem de semelhante, quando nós fazemos uma analogia, é também aquilo que eles possuem de diferente, porque no caso do aspecto social, nós vamos falar de uma distância social que existe entre os dois, embora no aspecto espacial, nós falemos de uma proximidade entre os dois. O mesmo acontece se nós pensarmos, então, em analogia nos demais aspectos, como, por exemplo, entre os aspectos jurídico e social.
Okay, so if you proceed by analyzing the social aspect, you can start off by looking at the concept social order. That is a unity in the multiplicity of social norms. You can speak about social distance, which we've done just now, where distance is a moment of similarity which shows itself. And then if you get along, you can speak about constancy, and constancy is actually makes an appeal to the core meaning of the kinematic aspect. It has the intuition of constant or continuous flow. So constancy could also be used as a term to characterize the uniqueness of the kinematic aspect. The physical aspect could be characterized by cause and effect, causality, and you can speak about social causality, social constancy, and social dynamics. You can speak about social growth, so social differentiation and integration. Then you are exploring the spatial analogies. And there are plenty of trends in the history of sociology who try to elevate the biotic analogy and consider society as if it is an organism, actually as an organism. So things like that always happen if they're not, in a meaningful way, give an account of the analogical basic concepts.
Então, quando nós pensamos no aspecto social, por exemplo, nós podemos falar de uma ordem social, em que há uma unidade na multiplicidade. Nós podemos falar de uma posição social, como nós já falamos, uma analogia com o aspecto espacial. Nós podemos falar de uma constância social, que seria, ou de uma continuidade, que seria um aspecto, uma analogia com o aspecto cinemático. Nós podemos falar de causa social, de causalidade social, que é uma analogia com o aspecto físico, de dinâmica social, crescimento social. E há até mesmo vários sociólogos que fazem analogias com o aspecto biótico e definem a sociedade como um organismo. Então, todas essas são analogias para as quais cada ciência especial precisa dar conta, ou seja, ela precisa explicar como essas analogias se referem à totalidade de significado.
Okay, just to move a little bit further ahead, there are different psychologistic trends in sociology. They try to reduce interactions to the individuals participating. Then you've got the issue of power and control, which are elements from the cultural historical aspect. And you've got the power theories of various authors in this regard. You can also move ahead and look at the way in which one can classify social forms of interaction. Then you are exploring the social within itself, so to speak. And you can, of course, contemplate the meaning of social harmony and social conflict, and the so-called theories of social conflict are multiple, and they've had a huge impact from Marx and some up to the recent past. And then of course, you can also look at the three later aspects: the jural, the ethical, and the fiduciary. And in those three instances, you can speak about social harmony, social justice, social integrity, and social certainty. And then you've covered the anticipations or anticipatory analogies to the last three aspects.
Então, nós continuando nessas analogias do aspecto social, há várias correntes da sociologia que focam nas interações humanas. Nós poderíamos falar, então, de analogias psicológicas ou psíquicas. Nós temos as discussões sobre poder e controle na sociologia, que são analogias com o aspecto histórico, o aspecto cultural. Nós temos todo o trabalho sobre formas de interação social, que são, por assim dizer, o aspecto social em si mesmo. Nós temos analogias estéticas, como o significado da harmonia social e do conflito. Há várias teorias sobre isso. E nós podemos ainda falar de analogia com os três últimos aspectos da ordem cosmonômica. Nós podemos falar de justiça social como sendo uma analogia do aspecto jurídico. Nós podemos falar de integridade social como analogia do aspecto ético. E nós podemos falar... I forgot the last analogy with the fiduciary aspect, Professor.
Integrity, social integrity, and then social certainty.
E por fim, então, a certeza social como sendo analogia com o aspecto fiduciário. Thank you.
Okay, so once you've done what we've done now, we've actually analyzed the elementary basic concepts of sociology, and every one you add to the story makes it more fully comprehensible what it is all about. Just to show it briefly, if you speak about a societal form of life, you can first of all specify it by referring to the fact that it combines a multiplicity of people into the social unity. The next specification is this multiplicity could be organized in such a way that you may speak of a social whole or a social totality. This social whole is an enduring, constantly present whole, and it lies at the basis of social interaction. And once you've had social interaction, you can specify it further by speaking about its social differentiation and social integration. And then you can move to the solidarity, the sensitive psychic meaning of the social. And then you can go ahead and say that you must contemplate conflict and harmony. So then you get to the logical specification, and then you have the relations of super and subordination or next to each other. And once you've had all these set alongside each other, you can not only in a meaningful way describe societal collectivities, but you can also now in a meaningful way define the meaning of social normativity. And listen now to the formulation I'm going to give, but you can first summarize before I give it.
Ok. Então, quando nós pensamos em todas essas analogias, um entendimento abrangente da sociologia vai começar, então, nos dando uma noção do que é a unidade e multiplicidade, o senso de integridade ou de inteireza de uma sociedade, né, a sociedade como esse aspecto espacial. Nós vamos falar das interações humanas, nós vamos falar do princípio da diferenciação e da integração, nós vamos falar da solidariedade social, que seria uma analogia do aspecto psíquico. Nós vamos falar de conflito e harmonia, e vamos dar vamos apresentar uma explicação para conflito e harmonia na sociedade. E então nós começamos a poder falar e descrever o que seriam coletividades sociais, o que seria o significado da normatividade social. E então nós, considerando todas essas analogias, nós podemos chegar a essa definição que eu vou apresentar.
Okay, let's do two things though. Look at the nature of a norm or a principle and see how we can classify social forms of interaction. Now, first of all, if you want to define a principle or a norm, you're not involved in an elementary basic concept, such as the concept social order. For if I want to define social order, I say it is the unity and the multiplicity of people bound together in a specific social sphere, which are constantly and so on and so on. So I'm using other terms, I'm using basic analogical terms in order to explain what social order is all about. But this is not yet a compound or a complex basic concept. A complex basic concept is encountered when you have to build into it all the foundational structural moments. Now, catch up with me, then I'll give you the example of a norm.
Ok. Então, quando nós apresentamos, por exemplo, uma definição de ordem social, nós recorremos a uma série de analogias com os demais aspectos da realidade. Mas é importante entender que usar analogias para essa definição não é o mesmo que apresentar um conceito complexo.
Okay, so I'm going to give you now a definition of a norm or a principle, and afterwards I will identify each one of the different modal aspects built into it, or the terms derived from specific aspects. One can say that this principle or norm is the starting point, which is universal and constant, and could only be enforced, made valid by a competent organ which displays or disposes over a free will which makes such a person accountable or not accountable for the unique historical circumstances requiring his or her interpretation of the situation in order to give positive shape to the principle in mind, or in case you want to come to that definition. So now we've covered it's a universal constant starting point. That's the first three aspects. Those terms characterize a principle before it has been applied, before it has been positivized. Then you get the other analogical moments, a competent organ. Organ is a biotic term, and competency is power, which is cultural historical. Then you have solidarity and sensitivity, which is another element. It comes from the sensitive psychical. And then contradiction and consensus. Those give to you the two schools of conflict theories and consensus theories in modern sociology. And then you have the sign mode, the sign aspect, where it comes to the question of how one interprets the unique historical situation in which you have to positivize the principle. So you can see I had to make an appeal to all the different aspects in order to characterize a social normal principle.
Então, por exemplo, se nós definirmos o que seria uma norma social ou um princípio social, nós poderíamos apresentar essa definição dizendo que uma norma ou um princípio social é um ponto de partida universal que emana de um órgão ou instituição competente que possui uma responsabilidade ou uma necessidade de prestar contas a partir de certos princípios de aplicações normativas ou antinormativas desse princípio na interpretação de circunstâncias históricas únicas. Quando nós pensamos nessa definição, nós vemos que existem várias analogias que são apresentadas aqui, analogias com o aspecto histórico, como, por exemplo, a ideia de um poder formativo que confere legitimidade a essa autoridade. Nós falamos de solidariedade, nós falamos de contradição e consenso. Então, todas essas analogias nos ajudam a definir o que é uma ordem, uma norma ou um princípio social.
Okay, now the question is, how can we classify social forms of interaction? And once again, that is a complex or a compound basic concept, and you need all the different analogical moments in order to come up with a proper circumscription of these forms of social interaction. You can simplify that, and I'll use the simplified version, by bringing together just a few of the basic concepts to illustrate the point I want to make. First of all, one can consider relations between human beings, which are incidental. You walk in the street, the lady is dropping her handkerchief, you bend over, pick it up and give it to her, and you walk off. Those kinds of what is the best word? The Dutch word and the Afrikaans word is maatschapsverhouding. You can say, okay, let's call them coordinational relations. This is an instance of picking up the handkerchief of a coordinational relationship. But then you can give one step further. If you go to the physical aspect, you find that there is an analogy of thermodynamic open systems. In spite of the elements that come and go, the identity and the durability of the living entity continues to be in action. But if you combine the two, then you can say, well, okay, let us look at social forms of interaction where, in spite of the fact that individuals come and go, the entity, the societal entity, still continues or maintains its existence. And you can think of the state where there's an enduring situation with citizens. They may come and go, government person, people, office bearers may come and go, but still the form of life maintain its persistence. And then, of course, you can add another step. You can say you need to give an account not only of the interaction and the coming and going without affecting the durability of such an entity, but you must also look at the durable relationship of super and subordination. And once you have those two, durable super and subordination, and an interaction which does not affect the enduring existence of the societal form of life. If you have both of them, you can call it, what do we call it in Dutch and in German, a verband. Let's call it collectivities. So then you have collectivities, and they must have both these properties, like the state. They must have the solidarity of the continuing people and an authority structure. And the same applies to the nuclear family, to the firm, to the university. So that makes it fairly easy to classify collectivities, verbanden. Communities are characterized by just one of these two. You either have a persistent existence or a super and subordination, you have a community. And then finally, in the case of individuals incidentally interacting on an equal footing with each other, there you get the coordinational relationships or the maatskaps relationships.
Ok, I can translate that. Então, quando nós levamos tudo isso em consideração, como nós podemos classificar formas de interação social? Mais uma vez, nós poderíamos ir por todas as analogias, né, analogias com todos os aspectos, mas nós podemos apresentar uma versão simplificada disso, recorrendo a alguns conceitos-chave. Existem três conceitos, três analogias que são importantes para nós classificarmos formas de interação social. As primeiras são as relações que são estabelecidas entre os seres humanos como indivíduos. Essas relações podem ser acidentais ou não. Uma segunda analogia é aquela que a gente pode fazer com o aspecto físico, a partir de uma ideia de sistemas termodinâmicos abertos. Nós podemos entender que as interações sociais, elas podem ser classificadas de acordo com a importância que os indivíduos, em particular, têm nessas formas de interação social. Por exemplo, existem formas de interações sociais que permanecem existindo, ou seja, elas são duráveis, elas persistem, muito embora os indivíduos particulares que compõem essas sociedades venham e vão. Quando a gente pensa no Estado, por exemplo, o Estado continua existindo, muito embora os indivíduos que compõem, os cidadãos que compõem esse Estado estejam sempre mudando por nascimento e morte. Então, a entidade social mantém a sua existência apesar dessa mudança nos indivíduos que a compõem. Uma terceira analogia que nós podemos apresentar para classificar as interações sociais são a existência de relações duráveis de super ou subordinação. A partir dessas três ideias, nós podemos, então, classificar as sociedades, as interações sociais como coletividades, comunidades ou coordenações. As coletividades são aquelas que possuem os três princípios, né? Então, as comunidades são aqueles que possuem apenas dois desses princípios, e quando não há sequer a necessidade de uma durabilidade nessas relações, nós podemos falar que existe apenas uma coordenação.
Well, that brings us to the 30 minutes you envisaged. Maybe that's a good point. Or do you want me to proceed still further?
Arthur.
Yes, Professor Danie. Vinicius have an appointment in the seminary in which he is studying. So we will lose Vinicius now because he needs to go to this appointment. And I think that we could finish the lecture for today and go to the questions. What do you think? And if Vinicius must go, I can try to translate the questions that we received in the chat.
Fine, that's great.
Professor, I'm going to leave right now. Thank you for your patience with my struggles today, and thank you for your lecture.
I understood more than you thought, and it was excellent. Thank you.
Obrigado, Vinícius. Obrigado mesmo. Professor, now I will try to translate the questions for you and to translate your answers to our audience, okay? We
Okay.
can schedule another meeting, we can schedule another lecture, and we can try to continue the conceptions that you were developing about the relation between the jural aspect and the social aspect in the development about a Dooyeweerdian perspective of the sociology of law. So for now, I first of all thank you for the lecture, and we'll try to do the questions if you have this time. You have time for this, right, Professor?
Yes, we can do that.
Okay, let's
That's
go.
fine.
We
You,
have
you,
we have we have different questions here about different subjects. So we can try to be objective with the answers. Romulo Barcelos has asked uh, that the human society has tried to explain reality from a Archimedean point. If mathematics, physics, biology was used to explain reality as all embracing disciplines, how can we understand the reality of the postmodern era, the postmodern time, or the perspective of the reality at the postmodernism? So
okay,
he is asking, how can we talk about reality without an absolute truth? Okay.
well, the question is very broad in a sense, but it's also not that broad because one can position postmodernism within the development of modern humanism, and the background is found in a controversy that dates back to Greek philosophy. It's a controversy that became known as the contest of universalia, and it is known as realism and nominalism. Now, realism latched on to Plato. Plato was confronted with a changing world in which we live. We referred to that earlier in my other lecture, or in the lecture. And in doing that, he realized that if everything changes, as Heraclitus claimed, then one cannot know anything because the moment you've known something, it already changed into something else. And that gave him the inspiration for his theory of ideas in a transcendent world of uh, ideal forms. And we can stop first there, or shall I make it complete the answer?
You can you can complete your answer, Professor. You cannot translate this answer, but you can complete, and I will try to pass in Portuguese some of the central ideas of your answer.
Okay, so what Plato discovered was that you can only establish change on the basis of something enduring or constant. So you can ask yourself or anyone in the audience uh, if that person looks the same today than 15 years ago. And you will say, no, not the same. Some differences and some changes got in action. You are aging and one can see it and so on and so forth. But then the issue is if you change, who is it that changed? You. So you remain the same person. And when you say everything changes, you don't realize that something is needed that does not change in order to speak about change. Okay, that's the first step for Plato. Then the second step, Aristotle said no, the ideas ought not to be up there in a transcendent realm of static forms. They should be inherent in the things. And he came up with a notion of form and matter. And when you combine the two, then you get substance. And if this house is generated, it is not houseness. Or if this house passes away, it is not this house. So houseness is universal, although it's attached to the individual thing, and this house points at what is individual. Now, these two accounts of universality, the one making an appeal actually to God's order for creatures, that's Plato stumbled upon God's law order, and Aristotle stumbled upon the orderliness, the lawfulness of this creation. So that's an interesting move because there you have already now tied the two most basic elements of the realistic view to God's law for and God's orderliness of. So
Okay.
try and put down there for a bikini.
Okay. No, I will continue to the other questions, and let's do this. I will translate the questions for you to English, and the answers will not be translated. So the audience will receive the answers in English. Okay?
Okay.
Because about the time and about my little capacity of of translating in this level of complexity. So Romulo Barcelos continues his question saying, besides that, which which part in this question about the postmodernism has the language? What is the part of language in the reality or the philosophy of reality of postmodernism?
Okay. You see, what I realize now is that about all these questions, I've written multiple articles. And one of them has the title, How Postmodern is Postmodernism? And I've written something, for example, on uh, conceptual understanding. What are the limits? And I've got multiple titles which I can mention to you and which could be consulted alongside whatever I answer right now. Of course, what I now answer is perhaps 5% of what I meaningfully have said in the past on the theme. But I'll just continue with this one because there's an element that you need to have to make it more complete, and that is that the medieval metaphysics harbored or gave shelter to these two legs of nominalism, of realism, the universal ideas in God's mind and the universal substantial form inside the individual things, and then thirdly, the universal concepts in the human mind. And what happened then by the end of the medieval period is that the universalia ante rem, those ideas in God's mind, the universalia in re, within the things, and the universalia within the human mind, post rem, mente humana, those were challenged by the nominalist movement of Occam and Duns Scotus, John the Scot. And they said, no, outside the human mind, there's nothing universal. And that is something very, very important. Of course, if there's nothing universal, they've eliminated God's order for and the God-given orderliness of entities. You can immediately see that. And what happened then was that reality was stripped of its order and orderliness. And once that happened, we were left with a heap of chaos. And once this heap of chaos is opened up for us, modern humanism realized that this is a gap that could be filled by the ideal of autonomously free reason. And if you try to do that, you are going to elevate the human understanding to become the lawgiver of nature and the world. Because if it's a chaos of entities and multiplicity of things, then you need something to bring order again. Hobbes made a thought experiment where he came up with the idea that let us hypothetically, in the thought experiment, break down reality into a heap of chaos, and then with an explicit hinge to the creational story in Genesis, and then we should try to re-establish order and build up a new cosmos according to the plan of reason. And Immanuel Kant was immensely impressed with Galileo or Galilei, who came up with an equally interesting thought experiment. And this thought experiment said, suppose there's a body on a plane, and this plane is stretched into infinity, and it's free of any impingement by a force or whatever. Then from this movement, it's clear that the body will continue its movement endlessly. But that means that we can sit in a chair, construct a thought experiment, derive from it a law of nature, the law of inertia, and then apply this law to the things in nature. So that suggested to Immanuel Kant that the laws of nature are not created from nature, but a priori applied to nature by the human understanding. So in this way, Kant elevated the human understanding to the a priori formal lawgiver of nature. And that underlies the autonomy ideal of modernity, and it is also lying at the basis of the idea that we construct our own world. That is part of postmodernism, but it goes back to the early 20s and 30s, 100 years ago. And that is a very important movement in modern humanism, because it now completed the circle. The human being is ultimately autonomous, a lawgiver unto himself or herself, and we have left God and his law order behind.
Okay, thank you, Professor. We have another question from Romulo Barcelos. He's asking about Michel Foucault. He saying that for Foucault, the social order is defined by structures of power. And he's asking if, in your opinion, is it possible to look for reality in this way? And how can the reformational philosophy answer and dialogue with these proposals of Michel Foucault?
Yes, it's interesting. Michel Foucault had some good insights in the relationship between constancy and change, and I've quoted him in different contexts on that. But he's very one-sided. If you are confronted with technical terms, you first have to ask yourself, what is the modal seat, the modal aspect in which they reside? And like we have said, in the numerical aspect, discrete quantity resides. In the spatial aspect, continuous extension has its modal seat. In the kinematic, constancy, and so on. But where does we put power? There are two forms: power over people, fellow human beings, and power over things in nature or cultural objects. So this is the location for power, but it is abused in a way by Foucault by trying to explain everything in terms of power relations. And when we classified social forms a bit earlier tonight, when we classified them, it was clear that it's just in the case of the third one that I've mentioned, the durable relation of super and subordination, that entails power formation. But power formation is not all and everything of reality and of society. And once you want to liberate yourself from this power syndrome, you have to realize that there are also human relationships like the coordinational relationships that cannot be explained purely by power relations. And those communities displaying only the enduring interaction of who belongs to the community is excluding the power relation of super and subordination. So it's a limited subdivision of our societal experience, and it cannot be elevated to the one and all of everything, or to explain everything within human society in terms of power relations. That is a historicistic or a poweristic misinterpretation of our social reality.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. We will proceed to the next question. And the question was sent by Victor De Camilo. And he is asking, how can we understand the analogical relations between the aspects? How can something that is eminently or genuinely theoretical, like philosophical abstractions, can be applied and understood in concrete phenomena?
Right, you've referred to concrete phenomena. Those could be physical things, material things. It could be
Or
plants.
social or social phenomena.
It could be
I
plants.
think
It
that
could be animals, and it could
I,
be societal entities. They are all
yes,
concrete.
yes.
So
I
that's
think
the
that
first
I
point.
think that
Secondly,
he I think that he sorry, Professor, by
sure.
interrupting you. I think that he is trying to talk about concrete phenomena as a general concept. I think that is speaking about the factual side, the plastic horizon of diverse philosophy.
Yes, but if you speak about the factual side, you have to keep in mind the correlate, the law side.
Perfect.
And there's no way in which you can anonymously, so to speak, generalize. You have to be specific. You have to say, okay, are you speaking about societal forms of interaction? One way to account for them could be to distinguish between solitary unitary character and a durable in relation of super subordination, and that helps you to classify coordinational, communal, and collective entities, and so on and so forth. So then you are specific in what you say. Otherwise, you are just flying around.
Okay. Okay.
But
And
I can explain it if you want to. Of course, the two dominant isms in the history of societal thinking could be called atomism or individualism, and holism or universalism. Now, universalism and individualism does not relate to the universal individual issue, but to the whole parts relationship and to the optal sum and addition sum. That's what it relates to. And if you realize that, then it's important also to realize that those two isms are one-sided, course or pairs of isms. And to show that, I can refer you to an article on the tension between methodological holism and methodological atomism.
yes,
And
yes. If you could send me this article, I can share this article with Victor.
okay, what I'll do is you can all access what I've done the past 50 years with the following link, daniestrauss.com.
Okay,
It's small letters,
perfect.
one word, daniestrauss.com, lowercase letters, and then you will find it arranged the last decade or so. You will find 110 articles, for example, and within them you will find the number of issues discussed right now.
Okay.
So
And
I'll a few out, and you can pursue the list. You will be a little bit surprised to see what you find there. It's a few hundred.
of course, I'm sure of this. Professor Victor has made other question, and he's asking, how can we relate, or how can we understand the relation between the theories and relations about the modal aspects and the typical relations about the individuality structures. I think that he means to ask about the relation between model laws and type laws.
Excellent. I'm glad that you have already grasped that difference. It's one of the most important ones you can come up with. The difference between modal laws and type laws. And you will find if you go to philosophy discipline of the disciplines, I assume you have an electronic version of that one. And you will find under the heading type laws and modal laws a number of references to different places. But the relationship is captured by what David himself called encapsis, the encaptic interlacement of an entity which is constituted or built up by more than one kind of entity, which are connected in such a way that they, on the one hand, serve the larger encaptic whole to which they belong, and on the other hand, retain an internal sphere of operation which could not be reduced or eliminated. And you'll find that at the end of my analysis of physical things, you will find an analysis of atom and molecule and macromolecule. And there are different other places. In the case, if you have access to the full volume work of Dooyeweerd, do you have access of his new critique, or not?
Yes.
Because there you will find some instances where he discusses societal encapsis and also the living cell and atom-molecule relationship. But you'll find it in philosophy discipline of the disciplines as well.
Perfect. Perfect. Great. We have another question, and this is the last question
Sure.
that we have. And Debson is asking, and he's trying to think about metaphors. And he is asking you, Professor, if you can talk about some paths that can guide us to an open society. He is using here the basis of the work as a basis, the work of Professor Bob Hausvar, Capitalism and Progress. And his question is, I think that the central point of his question is about the concept of a open society.
Okay, so first of all, you need to understand the metaphor. And the one way to do it is to look at the possibilities of analogies. We've defined an analogy when two things or aspects are similar in that respect in which they differ, you get into contact with an analogy. There are four options: between aspects, between things, the nose of the car, between aspects, social distance and spatial distance, and then aspect, entity, and entity aspect. So you have four options. I discussed them in PDD somewhere. I think it's 150 or 170, but you can check. You will find it, and then what I'll send to you is an article that I've written with a fairly extensive summary because it was written in Afrikaans. But there I explain it in more detail, and it's a fascinating theme. But nevertheless, metaphor and concept idea are going hand in hand. Once you interest yourself in metaphor, you can read the extensive abstract which I've written for my metaphor article. So you will enjoy it just to read the English version, I can assure you that. And because it explores and employs the key elements of David's reformational philosophy. And then you should also relate it to the distinction between conceptual knowledge and concepts transcending knowledge. And let me see, where do I... Yeah, one way to get into that kind of distinction would be, the articles that I mentioned, I shall lift out and send to you anyway, then you don't have to worry about forgetting what it was. But I'll send to you the issue, the article I've written on the substance concept and the idea of God. This is fully in English written, and you may find that also intriguing. But then the next step is the open society. Open is a metaphor, but it implicitly relates to the idea of open physical systems, and then you have to take into account the work of uh, written by the physicist on the open structure of living entities. Then you have uh, the physical aspect of the cell, it's written by Schrödinger, and he analyzes the whole issue of the atoms and molecules that are coming and going, and nonetheless the system maintains its relative identity. And that whole issue can then either be fully explored within the context of analogical basic concepts, because that constant flow of elements is an instance of constancy and change. And at the same time, you can use it as a metaphor to speak about the way in which Popper preferred to speak about society, the open society and its enemies.
Understood, Professor. I think that the answers and the indications of books and articles will be enough for the development of these reflections. Professor, now I have a question from myself, and in this book, my question is: in
Okay.
this book, you said in some point
Yes,
that the philosophical method of Hermann Doiver is a transcendental empirical method. Could you explain this?
that's right.
Could you explain to me a little bit more about this? Because this book is an introduction, so I think
Yeah.
that I will need to read a lot more to understand this term, transcendental empirical. But I think that with your help, I will start this now.
Okay. Let me just look at something if I have it here or not. I thought I had, but I didn't. Oh no, here I have it. I've written a book on the foundations of sociology, in which I've followed the standard route of analogical basic concepts, compound or complex basic concepts, and the fourth chapter started with typical concepts. Now, you will find an account of the transcendental empirical method in this book. Can you see this book?
Yes, I have this book.
Oh, you have it. Okay, so the transcendental empirical method is discussed, I think, from pages 105 to 120. But you, let me just check.
Perfect. I will open the book right here to confirm
It's
this, to confirm the pages.
111.
1 minute.
It has on page 11, start reading the transcendental empirical method, and it continues 21. Sorry, let me just check. Until the end of the page, it's 123, 111, 111 to 123. I give a fairly extensive analysis of the transcendental empirical method. So hopefully that can
Which
solve your
pages?
problems. Otherwise, pages
Could you say the
111,
pages? Okay.
111, 3 ones, 111 to page
Okay.
123. So it's the
Okay.
first letters
Now
of the numerical
now I see
alphabet.
it. Okay. Perfect.
If you have any questions, you all can also get my email address. If you want to ask me something, don't hesitate. Write an email and I'll answer.
Perfect. Professor, I have to in on behalf of all the all the participants of our audience, I must thank you. It was and it is a honor to be with you today. And we have been studying your works, your books, and your articles from some time. And we need to thank you and to thank God for your life and for your work and for your contributions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a sheer joy to share thoughts with you. Be well.
Perfect. We will try to do another lecture, and we can continue the reflections and the questions and the ideas that you tried to tell us today. Okay, Professor.
Sure. Thank you.
I will end the broadcast now, but I ask you if you have some minutes offline to talk with me. I will speak in Portuguese with
Sure.
our audience, and I will next end the broadcast. Okay?
Okay, so I just wait to see what happened to me
Ok.
now.
Pessoal,
Ok.
muito obrigado pelo tempo, muito obrigado pela paciência com as questões técnicas que nós tivemos aqui. Eu peço desculpa a vocês por nós não termos tido a oportunidade de receber as perguntas com uma tradução em português, né? Ou desculpa, receber as respostas às perguntas com uma tradução ao português, mas nós tivemos essa questão da limitação de horário aqui do Vinícius. Eu também não me arriscaria a traduzir essas respostas agora de repente, mas eu acredito que todos os que fizeram as perguntas tenham aproveitado as respostas de alguma maneira, e a live vai ficar gravada aqui no nosso canal do YouTube, então vocês podem acessar novamente e retornar nos pontos que o professor desenvolveu, e nós vamos tentar uma outra palestra com ele para fazermos um aprofundamento, uma continuação das nossas reflexões aqui hoje. Acho que foi um tempo muito bacana, a primeira vez que o professor Danie esteve no Brasil palestrando, refletindo junto com a gente. Eu acho que isso é um marco para nós, e eu queria agradecer e pedir que todos continuem acompanhando as programações do Centro de Estudos, e que todos tenham eu espero que todos tenham tido uma contribuição para a sua caminhada acadêmica e profissional com a nossa conversa de hoje. Nós continuamos, nossa missão continua sendo a capacitação de vocações. Nós estamos só começando com algumas dessas reflexões, muita coisa boa vem por aí. Tá bom, pessoal? Obrigado pelo tempo, eu estou encerrando aqui a transmissão ao vivo. Todos fiquem bem. Um grande abraço.